Welcome to this Generation Green New Deal conversation at the DC Environmental Film Festival. I want to thank the Film Festival for having us back for a second year in a row. It's really great to be here. So Generation Green New Deal is a multimedia project. We started as a documentary film, which I started directing in early 2019. We showed a preview last year at DCEFF. It was one of the first things that was canceled as a result of COVID, which was super fun. But during COVID, one of the things we shifted to do is producing a podcast. We've been producing a series of short educational and advocacy videos. And I know our audience has already received links to a lot of those things. We just wrapped up producing season 1 of the podcast, which is available wherever you get podcasts. Just search for Generation Green New Deal, and we're going to be releasing this conversation as a bonus episode. So Generation Green New Deal kind of spread into this multimedia project that includes a podcast, a film, which we're still in production on, and short videos. But the through line is that Generation Green New Deal looks at the new generation of activists who put the Green New Deal on the map and change the politics of climate in a really dramatic way. I'm joined by one of those activists, the newest member of our team, Nikayla Jefferson. Welcome, thank you for being here. Nikayla is a Sunrise activist and is a writer and has written some really amazing pieces on climate and various climate adjacent issues. And she is currently transitioning out of academia and into professional climate storytelling. So Nikayla, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Sam. That was a great introduction.
Awesome. So the first thing that I thought we could talk about is how each of us ended up doing climate work. So I came to this basically out of anxiety, which I think a lot of people, particularly young people, do. Climate seemed like something that was always this looming threat to, the world's future, to maybe my own future. And I didn't, through the sort of late 2000s, 2010s, like I didn't really feel like, I didn't know, I want to do something about climate, but I didn't know how to plug in. I felt like I didn't see the path for there to be a political solution to this crisis at the scale that the problem actually exists at. And I think 2 years ago, Sunrise Movement and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had this big moment in Nancy Pelosi's office where they called for a Green New Deal. And seeing that moment gave me hope and made me want to get involved, and particularly to start documenting that movement. That was how this whole Generation Green New Deal project came about. So yeah, how did you come into this, Nikayla?
Yeah, I mean, that story of hope, that's your story. I mean, that's my story too. Like, that is the main reason I joined the Sunrise Movement. Most people in the Sunrise Movement, like, they share in that. Like, for me though, it's like less about hope in the climate crisis specifically, and more about a general hope to repair the damage that we've done to each other and this planet, and build something beautiful that's just, inhabitable, a haven for human flourishing. Like, I've lived in California my whole life, so I'm very familiar with the drought and the wildfire and the mudslides and the climate disaster part of the crisis. But I'm also a woman, and I'm Black, and I'm queer, and the climate crisis is just kind of another weight on top of everything else, all the other existential crises people like me face. And the solution for that is abolition, emancipation. And the Green New Deal, I don't see as emancipation or abolition, because it's not. But what it is it's a piece of the solution, long term, the first piece, to buy us more time and to loosen these chains a bit. Because people can't organize. Like, we can't build a movement if people can't eat, if they don't have a place to sleep. Like, we can't build this bridge to the next world and reach a dream of freedom if, like, we're barely scraping by in this one. So I came into this work and into the Sunrise Movement as a writer and a storyteller, because I needed a vision to work towards. And I need to feel like I'm engaged in the struggle for a future. And Sunrise was my introduction to political organizing and the Green New Deal. Leah Stokes was my professor at the time, and she told me about it. She was like, look into the Sunrise Movement and the Green New Deal. Like, I think you'd like it. So one look was all it took for me. I was like, this is where it's at. These kids, they're doing something I really want to be a part of.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, this is something the two of us have talked about before. That the climate crisis is one existential crisis, but you know, communities, so many communities in this country, particularly communities of color, are facing many overlapping existential crises. And I think, I mean, the goal of the Green New Deal is to be an overlapping intersectional solution. So there's been, as we know, a lot of misinformation and Fox News propaganda about what the Green New Deal is and isn't. So I wanted to ask you to give me your definition and vision of what the Green New Deal is.
I think for me, I mean, the Green New Deal at the core, jobs and justice and climate, like that's the heart of it. I really see the Green New Deal as like, I mean, what it is, it's like this very transformative, comprehensive, national policy approach to addressing our carbon-based economy. So the Green New Deal I see is more of like a blueprint to what the next phase of America could look like, in the sense that we can have a program that gives people jobs and gives people healthcare, and we are on the track to a regenerative and sustainable economy. So yeah, the Green New Deal for me, it's something that anyone can build and anyone can be a part of.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about storytelling as part of that, as a key piece of that activism in developing that that vision of transforming society. You know, I think that I think you've talked about this and talked about some research on it, but like, you know, I think storytelling is really the key to the success to date of Sunrise and sort of the broader youth climate movement. Of like, if I could point to one thing that's like a big advance of this sort of new generation of activists on previous activism around climate, it's doing storytelling and doing like human centric storytelling much better. So I wanted to ask you, like, why storytelling, and particularly like creative storytelling, is so important to advancing advocacy on climate and environmental issues.
Oh my gosh, I love this question. I'm like, I love history. So pause me if I start spouting off here. But storytelling really is at like the heart of a movement, like any of them. I think of Frederick Douglass, and in 1845, he wrote the narrative of a life of an American slave. Like, he told his story in this book. And it was one of the most influential works in the fight for abolition in America. Like, he recounted a story of being Black in America, of being enslaved. And his testimony was so powerful, it moved the hearts and it changed the minds of white Americans. And 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, some basic rights and Reconstruction in the South. Obviously, we know how that story goes, though, with Jim Crow, cut it pretty short. But throughout the 50s and the 60s, again, in America, like, we get the story of being Black in America. It charged a movement, not even just here, but the decolonization movement in Africa and Asia, abroad. And like, now we're at another movement moment in the climate movement. And we have to tell the stories of being Black in America as a part of the climate movement. Like, I'm reading a lot about the socialist movement in the 30s and 40s, and it failed partly because the socialists, the white ones, they didn't see the story of being Black in America as important to the story of economic justice. They didn't know what to do about the Negro question, as they called it. In the climate movement, we can't make the same mistake. Like, being Black in America, it is the story of why we're in a time of climate crisis. It's the story of 400 years of extraction and exploitation, the story of choosing profit over people, and this inevitable reckoning of injustice when an ecosystem is so unbalanced and poisoned with white supremacy and exceptionalism, it's no longer able to carry on and it breaks. And that's where we're at right now. So there's like the lived evidence, right, of the power of storytelling. But we're also, I mean, from the academic world, like, the research and the data backs it up too. Like, stories are one of the most effective tools of persuasion. You share our experience in plain expression. from our heart, it tugs at their heart, and that's how we pull them onto our side. And like day one of the Sunrise Movement, for me, being told your most powerful tools and as an organizer is your story, and I've definitely found that to be true.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you sort of brought us into this realm, but I wanted to sort of underline the point of like, if I think back to a few years ago, like the kind of climate stories that I learned about as a teenager growing up, like, climate storytelling, climate filmmaking, climate media was very dominated by focus on polar bears, other endangered species. There was a talk of human impact that was sort of in the far future tense, like children and grandchildren. We heard a lot about children and grandchildren, and a lot of the spokespeople were scientists and other quote experts who tended to be white. I think you look at climate storytelling now, and there's been a big shift towards talking about direct human impacts. We're talking about the frontline and fence line communities that have been disproportionately affected by climate change, which are also disproportionately communities of color. And I guess as someone who's sort of transitioning from academia to storytelling professionally right now, like, do you want to talk about that narrative shift and like why that's so important? And I think more effective in mobilizing people of all, race and class backgrounds into this movement.
Yeah. Yeah. Polar bears and our grandkids. Yeah, that shift that's happened in the climate movement, I feel like it's really like parallel to my own life. Like as a kid, watching Al Gore with his terrifying graphs, and like, damn, like this is gonna suck for my great grandkids and all those polar bears. Like, it's gonna be so hot. Like, what are they gonna eat? Where are they gonna go? And then we had 2009, I think, Waxman Markey and cap and trade, right? Like a capitalist approach. And in 2009, that failed because there wasn't like a climate movement, and the bill was just about reducing carbon emissions on a big scale. That thought to like, okay, maybe we should reduce the toxic pollution from the communities that are breathing it first. It did nothing for the health of Americans. And in the middle of a recession, right, it did nothing for jobs either. Like the way we were talking about climate change, we were talking about in parts per million in greenhouse gases and putting guilt on people for driving their cars. Like it was totally the wrong approach. Climate is an issue of justice, and the solution needs to come from a grassroots and diverse movement, like not think tanks in suits. So we see this change start to happen. Like the climate movement starts to build, and it becomes less about the future and more about now. Like less about atmospheric carbon and more about human health. It went from being climate change to now being like crisis and emergency. Like we got these alarm bells blasting all over the globe. The academic community has come off mute and they're like, hey, like we need to do something. And we got kids in Europe and Asia and Africa and in North America, South America, leading these global movements, saying like, you got to read these reports. Like these people that they're talking about in 50 years, like that's us. Like migration, resource conflict, like that's going to happen in our lifetimes. Like that's me. So the movement is telling the story of like the present moment and in our future, and the emotional language and the imagery, like it's so powerful and effective.
Yeah. I think it is so much more effective, and I'm so glad that like more and more people from that academic and science world are willing to talk in sort of more stark and less careful. I think that like people have written about this. Like I think that academic community was very traumatized by like being accused of alarmism and by the sort of way that the fossil fuel companies manipulated data and manipulated the things that they said, and sort of went much too far in the direction of being very careful. I think it's good there's been at least a bit of a shift back in that direction. Maybe not enough. But yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit specifically on the issue of race in the climate movement. The uprisings. Yeah, I mean the uprisings last summer caused a reckoning, I think, in so many sectors of our society, including in the movements. But there's still so many people, a pundit who everyone on the left likes to hate, accused Sunrise of being a fake climate group because they also support defunding the police. But like that's sort of indicative of a broader tendency of, you know, mostly older white men to say that like climate needs to be put in a box and kept in a box. But I'm just curious, like how, as a Black woman in the climate movement, you sort of seen the way that these debates and shifts have happened over the past year.
Oh man, yeah, that shift when George Floyd was murdered in June, like that, I think that was my moment of like, whoa, like suddenly things just switched in the movement, and in the middle of a pandemic, right? Like I'm behind a mask, behind a megaphone, like speaking to thousands of people, and there was like no time to think. It was just this whirlwind moment over the weekend. And in Sunrise, San Diego, my friend and I we're the co-founders of the hub. Um, and through June, like they looked to us because like we were the only Black people in the hub. Like, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole movement looked to us and was like, what do we do? Because Sunrise, like, it's a pretty wide organization, and like we've got experience with like the sit-ins and the climate strikes, but racial justice uprisings, like these white kids didn't know what to do. Like it was like a moment of
Mm-hmm.
white paralysis for the movement. And it was hard for some people to connect the dots between what happened to George Floyd and the crisis of the climate. Like what we're fighting against, it's deeply rooted in white supremacy and exploitative economy and sacrificing the bodies and the communities of Black and brown people. And if we're going to build a long-term alternative solution to a carbon-based culture, we need to come to terms with that. We need to figure out how to address this question. And the people and the police, they're another environmental threat, right? They're the violent enforcers of oppression and racial hierarchy in America. So like, we need people to be free if we're going to build a multiracial cross-class movement, like the kind of movement we need to defeat the crisis of climate change. And yeah, Sunrise and a lot of it, the white people in the movement, I think they really got it. And they revised the organizational principles with language like abolition. They made the intersections of the crises like very clear. And they hosted a defund the police crash course actually, and I think it was the most popular training ever in the movement.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so I wanted to wrap up by talking about one other sort of big shift, narrative shift that I think the Green New Deal as a concept has really helped effect, and has even trickled into, you know, things like the way people like Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and, you know, liberal politicians are talking about climate, and that is the sort of moving away from the sort of doom and gloom and sacrifice narrative and towards sort of positive storytelling about like building a sustainable, decarbonized society, creating a society that's actually more just and abundant under you know, a decarbonization plan. And I think and linking climate action to creating jobs, to expanding unions. So, you know, why do you think that shift has been so important? And like, how do we as storytellers grapple with this sort of duality of like, you know, the very real sense of like dystopia and doom on the horizon, you know, the warning of that. On the other hand, like the potential, which I think is particularly for reaching beyond the sort of traditional activist white middle class bubble. You know, I think that like talking about, it seems like, and the data shows like talking about positive transformational change is the much more effective way of reaching people. So so yeah, how do we as storytellers sort of think about that duality?
Oh man, what a line to walk, right? Like it feels like we're walking right on the edge of the end of the world. Um,
Mm.
but as storytellers, like we have to hold the truth of the reality of like where we're at, and we also need to tell the story of the past. Like we are as a country, like where we've come from, the legacy of the struggle, and like where we're at right now. Like it's bad, but for long as we've been a country, like it's been bad for the people who aren't wealthy and white and cis men. Like it's been bad for women and non-binary people and indigenous people and immigrants and Black people, poor people, working class. Like crisis and social oppression are not new. and we've always survived, and we will. Like I feel that fully. Like we will survive. And focusing on the doom and the gloom, like we're gonna die narrative, I mean, it's just not helpful at a certain point. That point being when people feel so overwhelmed, they become apathetic and they just don't see the point in engaging with a movement for hope and progress. So, as storytellers, like leading with the vision, I think in the dream of all that it can be, like, sorry to go back to history here, but like taking these founding words, right? Like, oh, in the course of human events, a more perfect union, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, basic and inalienable rights, like take these words and make this country hold them high until they are true for everyone. Like that's how we've survived through the years, like gaining rights to the point that I can vote and I can marry and on paper I'm equal to white men. But like we still clearly have such a long way to go with that. But I see it happening in the future. And like that's where you got to tell the story from. So storytellers, like I really feel like telling the story of the future from that place of hope, that there is a time, like if we fight for it, that people have guaranteed healthcare and housing and jobs and a retirement plan, and that the healthiest economy is actually a decarbonized one, and that this greatness we've been told of as a country, like it hasn't even happened yet. So I feel like we're coming into our age as a country, like coming into our prime, and like thinking like as storytellers, really sharing the vision of wow, like what this country could be if we build a movement to make it happen. So it's balancing the very real climate anxiety and the scientific urgency, but not as we're running away from something, like we're running towards something.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a tough but important balance to walk, and I feel like more and more storytellers are doing it well. And I think it's the value we try to hold in our work. I also encourage anyone who hasn't seen it yet to check out the short film, animated film narrated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, "The Message to the Future." It is like a truly incredible piece of climate storytelling that really embodies that ability to like look into the future and show people how beautiful the future could look like in a situation in which we actually transform our economy and our society in a positive direction. So I think we are about out of time. So I wanted to wrap things up by saying thank you to the festival once again for hosting. Thank you to Nikayla for joining me, and want to encourage everyone watching to keep watching films from DCEFF. This will be running the whole week. There are so many incredible films about all sorts of environmental and climate related subjects being shown. So yeah, check out the full range of DCEFF events, and yeah, thank you.